Be joining us. Thank you, George, for that wonderfully warm introduction. As George noted, we're kicking off with two talks focusing on small finds assemblages, equally different but equally interesting talks. To start with is Jody Joy with a talk entitled On the Fringe or an Identity All Its Own, a new consideration of decorated Iron Age objects from Cambridgeshire. This is a pre-recorded talk, but Jody has kindly joined us and will be available for questions afterwards. Just before we start, a little bit of background about Jody. He's perhaps best known for his seminal work on Iron Age mirrors from Britain and Ireland, as well as his publications of the spectacular Chiseldon Cauldron Hoard and the long-awaited publication of the Snettisham Hoard and those fantastic talks from North Norfolk. He's also had major input in the show-stopping Celts Art and Identity project, exhibition that was held at the British Museum and the National Museum of Scotland a few years ago. And he is currently the Senior Curator of European Archaeology at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge, with a specific specialisation in European Iron Age artwork. So without further ado, George, could I please ask you to do the honours and host the video?
Absolutely. You should be seeing and an
Hello and good morning, everyone. So the inspiration for this presentation,
just making sure, can everyone hear that? Excellent. Then I shall let you continue, Jody.
Comes from a comment made by Chris Evans in a recent excavation report on an Iron Age site from Cambridgeshire. Chris compared the relatively modest artefact assemblage from the site to some of the wonderful examples of decorated metalwork from the county. And he questioned how such material could coexist with the relatively simple artefact worlds encountered when settlements from the region are excavated. This got me thinking. Several factors come into play. For example, valuable items are unlikely to have been casually disposed of, and we don't know what values were ascribed to different types of artefact. A possible disconnect remains nevertheless. In this presentation, I will investigate in more detail the potential role of decorated artefacts in the Iron Age of Cambridgeshire. I will draw on well-known objects, recent excavations, and objects recorded by the PAS. But first, I will give a brief introduction to the Cambridgeshire Iron Age. Especially for the latter part of the Iron Age, Cambridgeshire has always been viewed as somewhat of a border area. Not quite one thing or the other, hence the title of this presentation. The south of the county is on the edge of the tradition of rich cremation burials found in the southeast during the 1st centuries BC AD. Similarly, some very late sites in the north of the county have been linked to the Iceni. Further back in time, in the Middle Iron Age, the Fen Edge forms the limits of the East Midlands scored pottery tradition. Looking more broadly at settlement, when Cyril Fox wrote his landmark book on the archaeology of the region 100 years ago, he showed how the chalklands and gravel terraces along river valleys were densely populated. Recent excavations appear to show that there are settlements in these areas roughly every 500 metres or so. But more importantly, it has also revealed that the clay lands were equally densely occupied. By the late Iron Age, the whole landscape looked like a patchwork of houses and field systems. But it is difficult to categorise and simplify, and too easy to apply a blanket model of evenly spaced farmsteads. As with everything, the picture is more complicated than it first seems. Matt Brudenell has looked at population densities and suggested that some round structures categorised as houses may only have been seasonally occupied or could have served different functions, perhaps related to storage or livestock. There is also evidence for different types of settlement from the Wessex single farmstead archetype. In the south of the county, a series of pit settlements have been found, so called because evidence for houses is relatively ephemeral, and sites are located instead by the presence of pit clusters, often associated with an earthwork boundary. The pits provide evidence for complicated middling practices, perhaps related to agriculture, but also probably linked to belief systems. In addition, sometimes large wells were dug, probably for watering livestock. Elsewhere on the Fen Edge, people lived seemingly different lives, exploiting wetland resources. Other patterns of behaviour also varied greatly across the county and over time. Burial practices were far from universal, ranging from formal burials to bodies deposited in middens and heads placed in rivers, even to the modification and reuse of the human body, parts. So in sum, the Iron Age of Cambridgeshire is difficult, if not impossible, to categorise. The whole region was densely occupied for much of the period, and the landscape was efficiently managed for agriculture and other activities. Depositional practices and the variable disposal of human remains hint at a rich and complicated system of beliefs. It is against this backdrop that we must view decorated artefacts. I wanted to start with perhaps the best known Iron Age object from Cambridgeshire, this magnificent copper alloy spiral bracelet or armlet with beast-headed terminals. I highlight it because it exemplifies how many of us now encounter such objects in compendiums and catalogues of so-called Celtic art, separated from their context. The bracelet was found in a rich cremation burial dating to the very end of the Iron Age. The cremation was placed on a large bier, which is the large rectangular shape marked on the plan. In addition to the bracelet, other objects were also placed close to the cremated remains, including a belt buckle and some bone toggles, which I will turn to in a moment. On the other side of the grave was a significant amount of animal bone and pottery, including amphora, which can be divided into two main groups. Drinking cups of animal bone might represent the possessions of the deceased, accoutrements for an intimate meal with a companion. A larger group of mainly broken pottery might represent the remains of a funerary feast, with crockery being thrown into the grave to mark the end of the ceremony. In one corner of the grave was an iron shield boss. The iron shows signs of burning, and perhaps the shield was placed on the pyre alongside the body of the grave occupant. Its peripheral position in the grave perhaps alludes to a protective function. Overall, the impression is of a rich burial, but the grave itself also served a function beyond simply indicating the prestige of the grave occupant. It was a stage setting for spectacle, meant to be observed. Different parts of the grave probably alluded to different meanings and different performances. The human remains alongside some of the objects were burnt on the pyre. The remains were placed on the bier while still hot and carried to the graveside. On top of the pyre were probably placed personal objects of the deceased, including the bracelet. Accoutrements for an intimate meal were also put in the grave before finally mourners cast various pottery vessels from the graveside, probably marking the end of the funerary ceremonies. Returning to the objects positioned closest to the cremated remains, as suggested, these might represent the personal possessions of the deceased. One can well imagine the spiral bracelet with its beast-headed terminals creating a big impression on those who saw the grave occupant wearing it. Less well known now are these items. Made of bone, they were carefully made and decorated with inscribed lines and ring and dot motifs. These toggles probably formed a part of a horse harness or harnesses. Like the shield, they were also burnt on the pyre, and they must have been very important to the grave occupant, possibly just as significant as the bracelet. They perhaps also signal wider life relationships, maybe allusions to a favourite pony. The example of Snailwell and the contrasting treatment in modern archaeology of the spiral bracelet versus the bone toggles possibly tells us more about our own prejudices and tastes than the views of the person who owned and used the objects, and shows us how wary we should be when thinking about decorated objects from the Iron Age. With this lesson in mind, I will now turn to my data collection. It must be stressed I am at an early stage in my research, but I have tried to be as comprehensive as I can in terms of compiling my data set. In addition to searching through the collections of my own and other regional museums, as well as the collections of the British Museum, I've also drawn on the PAS. The document compiled by Duncan Garrow for the Technologies of Enchantment project, catalogues such as those set out by Jope and Spratling, as well as an exhausting search of both published excavation reports and the grey literature. Interesting contrasts can be seen between the types of objects highlighted and missed in each dataset, and perhaps that would be a good topic for another presentation. I've not so far been able to incorporate coins into my database, but this is an ambition. It is much harder to locate decorated objects made of ceramic, bone, antler, or wood, but I've done my best to locate at least some of these for this presentation. And I hope to extend this area of my research by continuing my explorations of the grey literature. So a search for broad period Iron Age, County Cambridgeshire, contains decoration in the description, on the PAS database revealed 74 artifacts. Actually says 70 here, but that's probably after I went through the data collection and looking through it. Split according to the database as follows, as you can see here. Leaving aside the brooches and the coins for the purpose of this presentation, it really wasn't a huge number of objects, especially when compared to neighbouring counties, particularly Norfolk. So I've sought sort of other data collection as well. And I was particularly interested by the number of vehicle fittings, which also seems low, even when supplemented with published finds. So in a kind of wider search, I looked at the Technologies of Enchantment database. Now they list 31 objects from Cambridgeshire. Again, this seems like a small number with over 2,500 decorated metal objects, excluding brooches and coins, listed in total from the British Isles by them. Most of the objects they detail come from well-known contexts. We've already discussed Snailwell, but if you take out the linchpins and fittings from Cone Fen, as well as the objects from the Newnham Croft burial, which I will discuss later, then only 15 or so other objects from the county are listed. So let's look at some of the objects. The PAS search revealed a relatively high number of cosmetic mortars and grinders. Looking at Ralph Jackson's catalogue, he identified at least a dozen more from the county, including this lovely example from Stony. Cosmetic mortars span the late Iron Age and early Roman periods, and their presence in relatively high numbers shows that personal appearance and identity may have been increasing concerns to at least some people in the county during the late Iron Age. In contrast, when we look at settlement evidence, it shows a great deal of continuity during the conquest period. Another item of note from the PAS database is this decorated pin from Isleham. As has been highlighted by Chris Evans, recent excavations have uncovered an increasing number of pins from the region. This is unusual, especially in southern Britain where pins are relatively rare, and may perhaps be tied to regional fashions and identity. One other very interesting PAS object is this ring from Great Chisel. It's very small, and the hole is slightly off-centre. I was very excited when I first saw this because I think its decoration is reminiscent of the plastic style, a style of the 3rd century BC, and more common on the continent and otherwise quite rare in Britain. So there is also a local parallel in the collections of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology from Abington Pigots, and you can see that next to the Great Chisel example on the right. Parallels for this type of object can also be seen on the continent, as far even as the Czech Republic. It is described by the PS as a harness ring, but I'm not so sure. The hole is too small for a toe or finger ring. So discussing the example from Abington Pigots, Mansell Spratling suggested that it could have been suspended on a necklace. I think that's a possibility. But I also wondered if it could have been a loop fastener, perhaps for a bag. Either way, these are not the only objects from Cambridgeshire with possible links to the continent and early styles of Celtic art. So this beautiful copper alloy bracelet from the probable grave at Newnham Croft in Cambridge is decorated in the Valdagersheim style, which is even earlier, dating to the late 4th century or early 3rd century BC. Another object, which is even earlier than this, and which instead relates to the so-called early style of Celtic art, is this scabbard from Wisbeach. And apologies for the pictures there, it's quite difficult to get good pictures of that object. Finally, we have this object in the plastic style, possibly part of a linchpin from the collections of the British Museum. Its find spot is uncertain and is described only as Cambridgeshire. Some have questioned its find spot, claiming it was more likely to derive from the continent and is possibly a more modern day import into Britain, perhaps collected by an antiquarian and subsequently discovered in Cambridgeshire after it had been lost. I think, though, that the evidence is accumulating for good contact between people in the region and the continent. Certainly, as we have seen from some of the objects I've just highlighted, they were aware of styles of art much more frequently seen on objects from the continent. As such, there is no reason why this object couldn't be an import from the continent, or perhaps even a local copy. In terms of examples of other art styles, we have already seen animals on the cosmetic grinder from Stony and the bracelet from Snailwell, but there are also these magnificent beasts. One from a tank and handle from Burwell on the left, and the other a fire dog from Lord's Bridge near Barton. There is also this lovely duck, possibly a little grebe, I think, listed on the PAS as possibly Iron Age. I think it's probably more likely to be Roman. If you look underneath, it's just the way the fitting works. I think it probably is, but more clearly Iron Age because of the decorative motif on its base. Is this little bird from Stony. Depictions of people, or possibly heroes or deities, are rare, but we do have this example from a sword scabbard found at Autumn Meadows. The mirror style of art is also represented on this beautiful sword scabbard from Iselin. The final object type that appears reasonably frequently on the PAS database are these various toggles and danglers. It's difficult to know exactly what they're for. I've always wondered if some of these could have been some form of horse decoration. This could be significant because compared to somewhere like Norfolk, as I've already mentioned, I haven't been able to identify that many objects such as turrets or linchpins one might associate with vehicles. This is probably overinterpretation, but I wonder if we can perhaps see regional preferences of transport here, with the riding of ponies more popular than vehicles in the Cambridgeshire region. I want to end my exploration of the decorated artefacts from Cambridgeshire by returning to non-metal objects. One of the highlights of my trawl of the published and grey literature is this decorated stave, possibly from a tankard from Wardy Hill. It provides a hint at some of the decoration that might now be missing from the archaeological record, obviously because it's made of perishable materials and no longer survives. More widely known is a series of decorated pots from the region, decorated with the curvilinear lines we might more normally expect to see on metalwork. Here are some examples from Addenbrooke's Hospital in the top left, then in the bottom left, Wardy Hill, and on the right from Barleycroft Farm. In his pottery reports on the site at Wardy Hill, J.D. Hill suggested that there was a pattern to this decorated pottery. Most later Iron Age assemblages from the region are dominated by undecorated vessels, but with a very few curvilinear designs, particularly made up of incised lines and sometimes circular stamps. Although the fabrics of these pots tend not to be typical for each site, the decorated vessels so far examined do not all share a common fabric, meaning that they probably don't all originate from the same source. Decorated pottery also seems to have been treated differently in deposition from undecorated vessels, which perhaps highlights its social importance. Similar patterns of the presence of small amounts of decorated pottery have been observed in neighbouring counties in Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire and parts of Essex. Perhaps these distinctive vessels had specific uses. I wonder if, for at least some time in the Iron Age, and in some locations, decorated pottery took on roles we might otherwise expect for metal objects, perhaps related to feasting. So, how do I wrap all of this up? And what does all this mean? As I mentioned, this research is in its early stages, so I'm only really able to sketch patterns and ideas so far. But returning to Chris Evans's comment outlined at the start of the presentation on the apparent disconnect between decorated items and what is generally found on sites, perhaps his observations are correct if we focus solely on material recovered from the small number of rich graves from the county. But when we look more closely, we see all sorts of possible arenas where decorated objects were important in society. Within this, we also need to consider non-metal items, which no doubt played important roles. Not only decorated pottery, By looking at the bone toggles from Snailwell, the role of objects we might easily dismiss because of our own prejudices when looking through site reports. These were clearly very significant personal items, but we only know this because they were given equal prominence to other seemingly more important objects in a rich grave. When considering all of this, we should also not forget that the decision to decorate or not is a crucial cultural choice. The fact that there were very few decorated items in circulation at a given time and place is not necessarily a sign of poverty. When we look at sites across the region, there is no shortage of evidence for very rich and complicated belief systems and sophisticated ways of living in any given environment. Perhaps there was at some times and places no social need for decorated items. One final thing I want to consider is the idea that Cambridgeshire was a kind of borderland at various times during the Iron Age. Neither one thing nor the other. Whilst there is some evidence for different ways of doing things in various parts of the county, treating such a large area as a borderland is also quite dangerous, as it risks dismissing one of the most richly investigated regions of the British Iron Age. The relatively high number of artefacts decorated with Celtic art styles, more commonly seen on the continent, shows that the region was a nursery ground for the development of Celtic art in Britain. It also provides evidence for contact, if not necessarily always direct, then certainly in terms of knowledge, of what was going on elsewhere. Similarly, the unusual prevalence of pins in the region could also be an expression of a specific regional identity we otherwise might not pick up from the archaeological record. Finally, quite often the most interesting things happen at the borders. Decorated objects such as the identified decorated pottery could have acted as a sort of boundary object, able to transgress cultural and conceptual boundaries and forming a key component of social exchanges between groups. These are the avenues of research I hope to develop further as my exploration continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jody. That was absolutely fascinating and some beautiful examples of insular Latin art. No questions in chat at the moment, but I wanted to ask you about this, not so much dichotomy, but this balance between, on the one hand, the very insular archaeology you find in Cambridge, like the ring-headed pins or the local ceramic styles, and how this contrasts with the apparent receptiveness to continental Latin art with the Valgalgesheim and plastic styles that you've uncovered in your research.
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a salutary lesson. Watching you self-present is really, really excruciating. And I don't know about everyone else, but I sort of sped up a bit. I don't know whether that was the connection or whatever it was, but it didn't in the recording, so apologies for that. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it kind of goes out to the wider Iron Age, and that kind of thing between local and not local. I think that you definitely see local concerns and regionality, but throughout the whole Iron Age, I think there's quite good evidence for continuing links in some way to the continent. That varies obviously between region and over time, but it's still there, if that makes sense. So it's one of those questions that's really hard to answer, but I think that you can still have local concerns, but still have an international outlook. Does that make sense? Or still be thinking about things more broadly. And what I think they do that happens specifically with Celtic art is, or art in general, is that you might take ideas of something and then use it in your own local context. And I think you can see that quite a lot.
Thank you very much. More general find from Prehistoric Finds, who asks, what do you think is the more likely option for the transmission of these decorated objects, import or local production?
Which ones do you mean, the earlier ones, or I think probably the linchpin I showed you, which has just Cambridgeshire. I think that's probably an import. The other ones are probably made locally, almost certainly. The actual transmission of that, I mean, are they seeing imported objects, getting ideas from that? Are some people traveling to the continent? Certainly the individual from Snailwell, I didn't talk about it much, but there's a belt buckle in there that looks like Andrew Fitzpatrick's talked about in a really interesting article on feasting in general. Looks like it could be linked to the continent and people going to the continent maybe as mercenaries or something like that. I think there's all sorts of different mechanisms that are happening. with that. But in the examples I've chosen, I showed you, I think most of them are probably made in the region, apart from possibly that one Lynch object from Cambridgeshire that's just Cambridgeshire in the plastic style.
Brilliant, thank you. I do understand that was one of the most sort of basic and broad questions I could possibly ask.
Yeah, no, it's a primary question and a fundamental question. It's just very hard to come up with answers. I think what I'm hopeful with is, you know, all of these different, the technology is the thing of the day, isn't it? All these different methods that are coming through. I've been looking at a lot at the archaeology of the Cambridge region because I'm doing an exhibition next year, and comparing what Fox knew 100 years ago to what we know now, it's like a completely different world. So I'm hopeful that these kind of, as technology advances, we're going to be able to help out on those kind of questions, those sort of fundamental questions.
And I suppose a shameless plug, when can we expect the exhibition and what will it be called?
It's going to be called The Archaeology of the Cambridge Region, not very original, but so it's basically a nod to Fox, but I don't want it to be about him, if that makes sense. I want it to be about what discoveries have been made in the region. So it'll open in June next year. I'm kind of halfway through deciding objects, but it's getting a little bit tense, so we'll see.
We still have a few more minutes for questions if anybody would like to. One I wanted to ask you about is this idea that you have people in Cambridgeshire riding individual ponies, in contrast to, say, Norfolk and Suffolk, where we've got much better evidence for cart or chariot teams. And in particular with the Snailwell burial, because it's quite interesting in that it's one of the only, I believe, 2 burials in Britain where you have evidence for individual horses being ridden, which has got much stronger continental parallels. Just, I suppose, general thoughts on that. Is that a reaction to the folk of East Anglia, or?
I think it's a bit speculative on me, but it just strikes me that it's very close to Suffolk and Norfolk, obviously. And that the only place where you really find horse gear is at Stony, and that's thought to be like an outpost of, I can never say Iceni, Iceni, or whatever they're called. It's meant to be an outpost of them. So, I mean, I'm skeptical about being able to say we can say that, but if it is, that kind of makes sense in terms of vehicles and stuff. Also in southern Cambridgeshire, actually not very far away from where I am now sitting, is like there is some evidence of some kind of pony farming or something along those lines in some of the later sites. So it's kind of speculative, and it kind of relies on those danglers being something to do with, you know, horses as well. But it did strike me as a bit strange in a way. And why not? You know, why not have some areas which, you know, are more reliant on vehicles and some areas which aren't? There's really nothing in the Cambridgeshire landscape which would make that happen. I mean, Norfolk's pretty flat, but so is Cambridgeshire. So I can't see anything in that kind of thing. I think it's interesting sort of thing to think about, and that's kind of what I was trying to do by looking at this decoration.
We've got one last question from David Breer, who asks, do we see continental connections all up to the east coast of Scotland, for example, with the pins, or is there a Lincolnshire-Yorkshire gap?
So that's interesting. So before this presentation, I reread what Chris Evans said. So when I wrote the presentation, it was based on remembering what he said. And he highlights this kind of, he calls it kind of a highland, like sort of upper bits where you might find pins all the way going up. So I think there might be a connection. So that's actually a really good question. So it might not necessarily be about kind of individual, like Cambridgeshire identity, but it might be something more to do with, I don't know, maybe even possible like what you're wearing. If you're wearing more thicker clothing or something like that, you need a pin. And what does a brooch do? Those brooches are so small, they quite often don't seem that functional quite often. They might just seem more kind of decorative or something. So there are all sorts of these different questions you can think about with the pins. I think there needs to be a lot more work on that, I think. But in terms of the question, I think it's a good point. I should have mentioned that really in the presentation, because Chris does pick up on it in his publication as well.
Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating.